Welcome. Is that too loud? All right. I'm so excited about our third writer in the writer series this semester, and I hope you are too. He's John Keene. He teaches at Rutgers. He's a famous writer who's well known for his book annotations, but he's coming out with a new selection of stories, and he'll be reading from that group of stories today. He's also a well-known translator and poet. I feel that sometimes long introductions kill the mood, so I'm not going to give you a long introduction. But I do have my sign-up list as usual, and I do have 2 copies signed by John Keene that I will give to you, to the first 2 people who ask a question. And we're going to do an interview like we did last time. And I'm really honored and pleased to welcome John Keene.
Let me make sure that I get this microphone right. I've had microphone disasters in the past. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. It is a beautiful day outside. It's still a little cold, but it's sunny. But in the absence of all that snow, I can understand why people might want to be outside rather than hearing someone read. I especially want to thank Dr. Jeffrey Beck for inviting me to Kean University. I've never been to Kean, even though I'm just right up the street at Rutgers, Newark. So it's wonderful to actually be here at this great university, and you're beautiful to get a chance actually to see a little of your beautiful campus. I'm going to be reading from a new book of, as Dr. Beck said, stories and novellas called Counter Narratives, although it's going to have a different title, a different cover, a really beautiful cover. I'll say this is, sometimes when you're a writer, you have one project you're working on, and then you end up doing another project, which is sort of like when you're in school and you're supposed to be writing one paper, and you end up doing something else that's a lot more fun. So I was supposed to be, it's kind of similar, right? So I was supposed to be writing, and I still am writing, a big novel. And writing a novel is like, writing a short story is like sprinting, and writing a novel is like running one of those distance events, like you're running the mile, or in some cases, if it's a really long novel, it's like the marathon. So I really wasn't ready, let's say, to continue the marathon. So I ended up writing over the last couple years about 11 stories, adding them to about 10 stories, adding to the 3 I already had. And so that is the result of that is this book. Okay. The other thing I just want to say, my work often is formally experimental, but the content also is somewhat experimental. And so I'll just say that this is a fairly straightforward story. Those of you who were in Jeff's class and read the story may have seen, I think, I don't know if he shared with you, but you may have seen it. It's got this sort of interesting situation. You can't fully see it, but it's got like these little boxes of text in the text, right? And those are song lyrics. And so I'm not going to read those, but I will just say that part of what I wanted to have you do as you're reading it, once you get the book, which will be out in May, let me just say that, the book will be out in May. Once you get the book is that as you're reading, you momentarily will stop to try to figure out what is in those little text boxes. But those text boxes are actually the songs that are running through the head of the main character. Okay. Let me just say a little bit about the story, and then I'll actually start reading. So the story is called Cold, and I wrote it after a friend of mine who loves to just find really kind of outrageous things on the internet. She found this really just crazy sheet music, and I think it was Baylor University's website. And it was just really sort of crazy, like minstrel era sheet music. And she said, John, can you believe this crap? The things that people use, because you think it was really crazy stuff actually used to appear in the newspapers and everything else, right? People would, before we had record players. I mean, some people even had phonographs back then, but before a lot of people had phonographs and could listen to records. Of course, now we carry music with us everywhere. A lot of times, people, if they could afford to, they would have a little piano, or they might have a guitar, a banjo or something, and they would play music to entertain each other. Of course, that was also before TV and radio. So a lot of times, newspapers would carry the sheet music, or you could buy sheet music. And I think one of the big sheet music stores in New York just closed. So just sort of give you a sense of how, even in our lifetimes, is still the possibility of getting sheet music still existed. But anyway, so she found this crazy sheet music, and I thought, who was the person who wrote this? So I had to look it up, and it turned out it was this guy named Bob Cole. Let me ask: has anyone ever heard of Bob Cole? No, of course you haven't, right? Because Bob Cole is totally forgotten. But the amazing thing about Bob Cole was he was one of the major songwriters of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he wrote minstrel songs, he wrote songs for plays, he was an actor, he was a performer, he basically did it all. He was a black man, but he performed in blackface. He became very rich, and then I learned at the end of his life, he did himself in the Catskill Creek up in Catskill, New York. And I thought, why would someone who was so wealthy and so successful do himself in? And the interesting thing about him was one of his partners was a guy named J. Rosamond Johnson, whose brother, James Weldon Johnson, actually is still very famous for having written what's called the Negro National Anthem. Some of you may know it, lift every voice and sing. Okay, so, but Cole is totally forgotten. Okay, so the other thing I just want to say is you're going to hear at a certain point the words of a song come in. And let me ask you, have any of you ever seen the famous movie starring Judy Garland, Meet Me in St. Louis? Okay, so you have seen that. Yeah. I recommend it. It's a great movie. It's set during the 1904 World's Fair. And there are a number of songs that Judy Garland and the other actors and actresses perform. So one of the most famous is Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, which is still famous and which people still sing today. And Frank Sinatra made it famous. I mean, any number of great singers. I want to say Whitney Houston sang it, but any number of major singers have sung Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. But another one of the songs that is performed in that musical, which is a movie musical, is called Under the Bamboo Tree. And in the performance, Judy Garland and the child actress Tootie, who's also one of the real stars, I mean, she gives a great performance, they perform what's called a cakewalk, which was a very famous minstrel dance. And most people, probably in 1944 when the movie came out, which was right before the end of World War II, probably would have remembered the cakewalk. But now, of course, when you watch the movie, you just think, oh my God, this is like this great performance. Of course, Judy Garland has an extraordinary voice. So you just hear Judy Garland sing, and her and Margaret, she and Margaret O'Brien dance, and you think this is great. But again, I had not realized that it was Bob Cole who did it. You can find it on YouTube and everything. So anyway, so let me read now Cold. Cold. It's fastest, someone warned you, when you let go. Here in the sweltering dining room, you recognize no one, not a soul. Your mother took her supper at the usual hour and has already returned to her room. When you've come with her before or alone, you've usually spotted at least one familiar face from the city or Philly or Baltimore, since from June to the first turning of the leaves, people arrive every weekend from all over. Like several other hotels in Catskill, Miss English's has welcomed you, your mother, almost all who pay, permitting stays without incident. There have, however, been a few. Whenever one of them who has no clue about how the settler rules this side of the Mason-Dixon line function, how the law sometimes falls on the other side. There was that time in the hotel on Cowderskill when you were asked to vacate your room and move to the other wing because the Carolinian took grave offense that you shared the same linens and dishes, that you might brush against his wife in the hallway or stairwell, as if you could not walk a straight or even angled line away from her, as if you had no will, as if you ever cast a second glance at her or any woman, white woman. And that hotel's owner, a round, pasty little man with a voice like a duck call, had said that he wanted to avoid any trouble. Please just move. He'd throw in a free whiskey as consolation. That afternoon, in what felt like a stupor, you had packed up and settled into your new chamber over here, from which you could see the creek and the mountains instead of your previous ampler river view. The one you'd reserved half a year in advance, and you fumed for a while until a bar, oh yes, Lord, then the full song belled in your head and you spent the afternoon in bed scoring it. Even here, you know better than to linger when the dancing begins or challenge one of them on the tennis court. The New Yorkers, city dwellers or upstaters, native or immigrant, do not so much as blink when they see you, staring mainly at the cut of your full dress suits and shoes, your mother's elegant day ensembles and summer gowns, as if viewing an exhibit. Only one or two of them is ever known who they were looking at, or for that matter, uttered more than a simple slur. The surface appears tranquil. Beware the undertow. The tan hand slides the bowl of soup beneath your chin. You return what feels like a smile, but almost isn't, vicious-wise. For the last month or 2 or 5, has it been a year? Why can you not remember these newest melodies you cannot flush from your head like a player piano with an endless roll, scrolling till infinity? Songs have always come one by one or in pairs, dozens. You set them down to paper, to poetry, like when you took the solemn melody of the spiritual Rosamond was whistling as you walked up Broadway and in your head, and later on musical paper clothed it in brand new robes. Then, somewhere along the way, after the first terrible blues struck, you tried to hum a new tune, conjure one. You thought it was just exhaustion, your mind too tired to refresh itself as it always had. That's why the old ones wouldn't go away. A few memory games like rambling inside the rooms of your vast mental castle on the Nile, as you called it, and the one song that resulted from it, filling each one with various quilts of harmonies from throughout your life. The sound of an engine starting, horses galloping up the road, because there were horses still on the roads then, horses galloping up the road, boat horns from the direction of the Hudson, keys to release you from the musical bondage, from any of 1,000 things you spot and listen to as you stroll up 136th Street, all the conversations, personal or overheard, hymns, ditty stomps, work songs, quadrilles, cakewalks, rags. Could dispel these new ones until they did. Then more appear, stuck as if a band has struck up the opening notes of the Black 400 in your skull and decided to keep playing it forever. We have your trials here below. What's a poor brother to do? You fear you can sometimes hear the upper octaves combining towards a crescendo that, soon as you open your mouth, might explode. Close your eyes and let your head lay back. No, close your eyes and lay your head back. For a few minutes, you recline in your seat, suppressing a cry, rise, eyes shut after only a few spoonfuls. Your fingers trace cannons around your temples. You should head up to your mother's room and tell her that it's getting worse. Again, let her minister to you. She used to know how to calm you down with words, a touch. Mrs. Isabella, he's rattling on something, can't no one understand. Settle what between your ears only once in a while back in the day became a racket. You should hurry to the phone in the alcove and have the operator connect you to Rosamond or his brother Jimmy, your big sister down in Atlanta. Call Ida Walker or Bert Williams, whose traveling schedule you can't remember, though you wrote down the dates in your notebook, even Erlinger or Claw. At least leave word for them all. It wouldn't take that long for someone to drive up or hire a car or take the elevator to Grand Central and be here before the night is out. Fact is, you should not have told the attendants at the Manhattan State Hospital for the Insane you were free of the interminable internal bellowing. You should not have assured them you'd be fully in Mrs. Isabella's care, that the tempest of those songs had died down, like those ones in these ones like January storms that grind on all through the evening and the morning, so persistent and fortissimo at times you can feel them chattering like piano hammers along your crown. As you stand at the table, you recall that moment when you couldn't stop caterwauling them. Sometimes you're on the floorboards, how the neighbors banged on the walls, the front door, gathered on the stoop as they came and carried you downstairs saying, "Mr. Cole, you all right? Poor thing, you know, he wrote The Girl with Dreamy Eyes." I'm gonna pray for the man. Everybody can see how bad off he is. My sis saw his Sambo girls in Hartford, and just keeping them in lines what broke him in two. Inky Dink sold his soul to you-know-who to line them damn pockets. All these comments tipped with interest, yes, and cheek contempt twinned with compassion to the accompaniment of that sonorous, infernal drone. Devil's arias, you penned them, showfuls. In your 20s, it had all flowed so easily. You'd sealed the deal, the singing, the wisecracks, the dancing, all those God-forsaken songs, that cooning and crooning minstrelsy, copying a mountain of green, in return concreting a vision of you, of all of you in their heads, your own, the nigga who could do no wrong with the Creole show, the All-Star show, and later Black Patty's Troubadours, before you turned it inside out again alone and with Rosamond, his brother Jimmy. These songs, unlike the previous ones, these were yours, nothing to feel like this pang of shame about. Any colored person could whistle them without a pause. Heard yourself undreamt, unsummoned, sonic suns blasting behind your eyes, these terrible samplings of the old and unfamiliar. You should have told the attendants how your agent and the publishing firm's representative had said in almost the exact same words about your newest pieces. Bob, what has gotten into you? These notes together don't make any melodic or harmonic sense. How the arranger had cackled with reproach. Cole, you have 4 or 5 different polyrhythms running concurrently. No man can play this. How Rosamond himself whispered, this side of sorrow, as he clasped your hand. Bob, this mess on the other side of sound. Everyone began to train the same look on you. The bank cashier, the postman, the barber, the Bajan shoe shine, the tiny boy black as a crow with the crowbar who cranks cars for a cent on Linux, the humpback beggar guarding the curb collaring. Mister, you need my help. As you sat there on the front steps trying to massage the rondos out of your brow, your sinuses, your freshly trimmed and pomaded locks, trying to express them out. Mister, you need me to call somebody? Excuse me, officer, I think that gentleman sitting over there humming and crying to himself need. Allow the foliage below an easy embrace. You mop your forehead free of the film of sweat the August heat has pasted there. Wipe the dew from your chest's silver curls, crumpling the napkin beside the untouched knife and fork. Somehow the heat down in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, like this interior clamor, has followed you north. Everyone around you is fanning themselves, reclining on benches or couches, already displaying, like the underarms of your violet linen suit, the dark, wet badges of the season's relentlessness. Your mother, no stranger to heat waves, has taken to afternoon naps in the still silent dark. Bad as it is up here, though, it's worse, you know, far worse down in Manhattan. You gulp down a glass of water warmer than the soup, polish off a second, soon as it's poured. Sometimes the songs make you so dizzy you forget where you are. You've tried every manner of patent medicine, the one that tastes like licorice and the one that tastes like silver, the one that's made from coal ash and the one that's made from pine resin. Neither whiskey nor gin nor cocaine nor hemp nor hashish does the trick. You can't easily get your hands on opium. Only sleep, morphine, and the unknown dulling potion the orderlies provide temporarily blotted out. Then, soon as you stir, you're back at this internal concert, on stage again inside your head as Willie Wayside, performing with Billy at the Standard in Kansas City, twirling that mahogany cane and jigging at the Pekin and Savoy in Chicago, only without the cork mask and zinc lips and red wig and patchwork coats and satin lapels and tails and pop-top hat and tap shoes polished to the consistency of glass, and the orchestra without the after parties and champagne breakfast, without the evening ending and you being able to sleep a whole night through. Without these notes peeling into bedlam, nobody knows. Why did you ever write them? Who did you write them for? Yourself and them, more them than you did not want to. Now dare to admit these songs still reeling and unreeling, unreal daily, hourly, by the minute, you in your head, you can't, simply cannot, can no longer bear it. Open your mouth as if you intend to swallow. You set the glass down and head for the door. Excuse me, sir, you finished? The young man, so light in his features, hair texture announces story, murmurs politely. Can I get you anything else, sir? Send something up to your room? You pause, look him over, see the eyes catching yours. Another time you think. Shake him off, force a half smile when you catch his flash of recognition, or perhaps it's just that broader sense of a link mixed with abstract solidarity, so common wherever you see each other, our people, even if no one else fully sees you, until the stain of disdain seeps in. Perhaps a young man stood at the doorway as you regaled everyone last night with a few of the songs your fingers played from memory, since your mind would not cooperate. You could see your mother beaming from her seat as you completed under the bamboo tree, nodding, clapping her eyes, telling you that everything was all right, although it wasn't, it isn't. Perhaps years before he saw you staring back from a handbill, contentedly, unlike now, and he too secretly blames you. They all do, for how you all are viewed. You pass the check-in desk. The doorman, dark as a pneumatic tire, in elaborate livery despite the heat, swings the door open. You flinch, seeing your own face staring back, your mug never so cool or placid except in photographs, engravings, the same wide forehead, broad, slender lips, lantern eyes bearing something outward while beaming back in, making you glad no mirrors nearby, that you never saw yourself on stage, made up and masked, always masked, that awful jamble, thankfully never captured for the Nickelodeon or on a gramophone. You recover and extract the soul bill, $10 you have, and some coins from amid the gold weight and the paperweight you stuffed this morning in each of your trouser pockets, and placed the money in that other palm, sheathed in white cotton, beneath which you know lies a square of pink ridge with brown like your own, as your grip tenses, relaxes. The hurdy-gurdy in your head churns on. Thank you so much, sir. Shall I call you a driver, sir? The doorman asks, assuming correctly that you will not want to walk in this heat through the streets toward downtown, or perhaps you might be heading to Athens or across the river to Hudson. No, no, thank you. You mean to say, as if you were there, staves and quarter notes stalling your tongue, spilling out. You think you assure the doorman you're fine with the wave, and head in the opposite direction, away from the town and river, northwest instead, over the meadow towards Maine. The first response is to struggle, but you should stifle it. On the lawn as you pass a seated trio is laughing. Beneath them spreads a lake of gingham. You know the couple initially because of your stays here, later after time spent with them in the city and at their home. Luther and Anna, they travel down from Buffalo, where he has a general practice and also runs a local colored paper, and she teaches school. You chatted with them briefly yesterday when you got in. The other woman, pretty enough to be a movie star if colored women starred in movies, looks familiar, but you cannot place her. Gwendolyn, they introduce her, from Boston. She was here last year with her parents, the father a bishop of some sort. Now you remember, I'll bet 6 bits she was one of Anna's former students, you said to yourself before you met her then. They are trying to make that kind of introduction again. She straightens the ribbons in her loose black locks before you take her hand and drop it. She is saying something to you about your songs, your shows, as you think you hear Luther ask, why don't you join us, Bob? He and Anna nodding. She adds, we'd like that. We haven't hardly seen you since you arrived. You cannot hear what Gwendolyn is saying, as if someone has a trombone against your lobes, playing an ostinato, the same long, low phrase. Then the original song comes back and you feel light, almost giddy. Whisper, you're going to walk over to the creek. If you see yourself going along so, Luther looks at Anna. They lift themselves up to you. You touch your hairline where the music threatens to erupt as they gather up the knives and forks, the bread and honey, the corked bottle of lemonade, place it in the basket, fold up the cloth. Luther and Anna's manners, each as precise as they have always been, as anyone would expect of folks of their station. Gwendolyn hangs back, fanning herself, her eyes trained on you. You mean to say something about the weather, but no words emerged. No words, nothing about the food, the staff, your mother, Luther's suit, Anna's dress, the shade of creme anglaise, Boston, Harlem, Rosamond or Jimmy, the Sambo Girls Company, or your other efforts, touring, business in general, Gwendolyn, in whom you'd never be interested, your other friends in New York you would never discuss, let alone hint at, the train ride up, the last few months, years, the long winters of blue periods that have plagued you even before the music could not be turned off. Only a sound that sounds like the inside of a sound, a not whistle, a not warble, not words, a code, a cloud of could and cannot. And Luther laces his arm in yours, Anna close by on his other side, the basket on her free arm, Gwendolyn somewhere behind them, humming. Why is she humming? Two live as one of your tunes, or is that you and the sound is escaping you, as it sometimes does? If you like a me and I like a you, as you proceed across the grass to the road. There is no way to counter the initial pain or burning sensation. but eventually it will subside. Luther's arm slows you, stops you here at the roadside. You pause to pat your cheeks dry, your chest. The late afternoon heat is intensifying. You all pause as cars and carriages barrel by. Anna is talking again, something about her people who came up from Richmond to visit, some other folks they met during a trip to Ottawa, the ones appearing every day in Buffalo from Kentucky to Kingston, their planned cruise to Venezuela. What did you think about all the lynching so far this year? What do you think about this new National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in New York, those white liberals and our folk who belong to the upper 10, Rosamond and Jimmy know people involved with it. You do too. What do you think? Luther's agreeing with everything she says, his voice like hers softening as if to distract you, and though you cannot hear anything they're saying clearly anymore, hear anything beyond this interior echo, though you perceive somewhere in their tone something else, in the rhythms of their words, the blade of rebuke, not even friendship can hide it. You know what you did. They want to say what you wrote, how you helped to sow the sickness even in the minds of your own. You know what you did and tighten your fingers on the weights, so solid the gold, so smooth the glass. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but they're anchoring you right here. What do you think as you squeeze on the weights? What do you think and you do not? Gwendolyn, whose voice tinkles like a triangle slightly out of tune, has taken your elbow in her hand, fanning you as she inspects your eyes, your trembling lips. She asks if you would like a drink of water. Luther pats you on the back and suggests you all continue to the creek, sit on its banks briefly and rest, then return to the hotel. You want to say you were heading there anyway. Anyways, the shade of the paper, birches, and slippery elms letting you cool off before you continue on your intended journey. You wag your head, something issuing from your insides, something that is and is not the noise buzzing in your brain, your throat, all down the column of your spine into your toes. You can almost arrest snippets. You know these songs by heart. How many times did you perform them by heart? Stand before that wall of stairs and pull everything from your heart by heart, record them by heart. You could put on a show right now by heart, as you did last night by heart, here on this greensward by heart, anywhere you wanted to by heart, like you used to, like you did in the park that by heart that night, and the man, that midnight man standing above you, just turned on his heels and ran. You're squatting there and could not stop yourself, and the entire routine of a trip to Coontown came out, every single note, not one miss, and it wasn't until a small crowd out seeking just like you had surrounded you, their shapes stirring the black, that you realized where you were. Luther guides you to a spot they've picked. Gwendolyn dresses it with the gingham cloth. Almost done. As your mind goes black, begin counting backwards. The years, where have they gone? 1911, 1910, 1909. Nobody knows the trouble. Finally, words erupt from you. I'm going to go for a swim. They look puzzled. Anna is whispering, reminding her husband she did not bring her swimsuit, and you can all try tomorrow at the river, but you hurtle forward down the slope into the water. Bob, Luther is saying. Bob, and you're pantomiming, because no more words will flow. Only the music, forehead steaming, you were miming, swimming, waving to them and grinning, that wit and play acting that always got everyone, this time without the coal or charcoal corking or the floppy hat. Bob, and you do the crawl and the side stroke and the breaststroke, your arms windmilling the air. You can feel the creek water in your shoes, halfway to your knees, your drawers. If you like a me, eyes gleaming, cold, and I like a you, and you can hear it now too, the creek streaming, the water, no wig or whiskers now, no polish, must have been a dream, and never again. Bob, come on out. Luther is walking towards you, never again, to croon a coon song, Uncle Rastus, you wave him off, the water at your chest, dreaming all the time you tried. Bob, come on out. How you tried, but it kept leaking in. Moon, don't make me wait in vain tonight. No whistling coon, no more, no cane or jig now. Oh, soul, you cut it out soon as you could, so loud, the music and those voices. Bob, that all this was a seeming, you ducking beneath the surface, the hot hate flowing away, swimming away. No, Bob, baby Anna now, someone crying out and crying, Gwendolyn, please go get someone from the hotel, and Mrs. Isabella sinking, go soul, under the bamboo tree, Zulu from Madabu, they never knew you blues, the true you dreaming, the true you, nobody's looking, nobody knows, no coon, no more, to live as one, they will never harm you at all, soul, no coon, a man bending down into the mud as quick as someone would advise you when you completely let go, because because the surface appears tranquil, but beneath there's the undertow. And you shut your eyes and lay your head back, knowing the current and your weight, since the metal and glass in your pockets will do much of the work, but just in case you open your mouth because you intend to swallow, battling and defeating the impulse to struggle. You feel the first stabs of pain or burning in your chest, no worse than the pain of that music you knew best. Eventually it will too subside, that bonfire, the nightmare track, as your mind turns back into the blackness. You count backwards, joining in your song, no coon, no more, nobody knows the trouble I've seen but Jesus. If you get there before I do, tell all my friends I'm coming, until the music breaks into a screaming silence that if you could describe it in a word would be no word or note or sound at all, but fleetingly, freeingly cold. Thank you.
These are the first two answers.
Yay! During your reading, I noticed a lot of music terminology. I was just wondering what your background is in music.
That's a great question. I never formally studied music when I was in grade school and junior high. I played in the band and the orchestra and learned to play the piano and learned to play the clarinet. And then when I was I went to a parochial school when I was really young. And we had such a small little band. I guess it was band or orchestra, whatever you want to call it. And it was so small that our teacher decided that we would all learn to play all the instruments, which of course nowadays I think parents would probably say, you kind of want all these strange children, on my child's clarinet or flute or whatever. So we all switched briefly all of the instruments. So, I briefly learned to play the flute and the trumpet, and I'm trying to think of what else. I don't think maybe the violin. I think we might have one violin, but primarily the clarinet. But I never formally studied music. But also I grew up in a house where my father listened to all kinds of music, primarily jazz, R&B, soul, but he had some classical music, some country music, blues, and stuff. So, and then on the radio, I used to listen to rock and roll and everything. So all that music is in my head. So I think that also informs, or heavily informs, my sense of music.
Thank you. So, right over. So, in your reading, you had characters. I'm not sure if they're fictional or actually historical to his life, but you had attributed them to an instrument specifically. If they are historically true, did the instrument that you had chosen for them reflect on their historical character?
That's a great question. Actually, I'll say, one of the good things about being a fiction writer is you can make things up, right? You don't get in trouble. If I were a historian and I were writing Bob Cole's story, I would have to make sure that everything that I put in this story was documented. But I did, so I sort of played around a little bit. And for example, like with Bob Cole, sort of the end of his life, if you look, and I actually did after I started writing the story, so I wanted to write the story first and then do a little bit of research. So after I started writing the story, then I actually looked up the obituaries and descriptions of his final days. I kept finding different accounts. And no one could sort of pinpoint why he first was institutionalized at various points, and then why he committed suicide. So I thought, wouldn't it be really interesting if someone who loved music and was so talented could, so it's almost like, you have, and multiple tracks of music, right? So to the point where it's almost sort of overwhelming and you can't even hear anything anymore. So that was something I made up. But yeah, I did play a little bit with the attribution of different instruments to the different characters.
Other questions? I've got a lot. All right, feel free to break in. I'm sure your questions. Oh, here we go.
When you said about that you had done the research after writing, so does that mean that you found out that he had killed himself by drowning after you wrote the story, or did you know that first and then you got more of a background? Because I was fascinated by the whole thing with drowning. It's heartbreaking.
That's an excellent question. I actually did see, I think if you look up on Wikipedia, you can, I think that's where I first saw that he had died by drowning in Catskill. And so that it raised a lot of questions because, of course, that was 10, I guess, was the era of segregation. So I had to do a little bit of research, to sort of just get basic things right. But often what I'll do, and a lot of the stories here are historical, is I will just start writing and see how far I can go. And then, with a little bit of kernel of information, and then go back and kind of check things so that, you don't want to write a story that's 100 pages where you keep describing, people walking down a sidewalk and there weren't sidewalks. I've done that, that's what I say. Because of course, if you make it science fiction, you can do anything. But this isn't exactly science fiction. So, so I knew that he had, from Wikipedia, that he drowned himself in this creek. And so I started writing and imagining, because I've been up to Catskill and Hudson, those towns up the Hudson. And I was really curious about this. I was like, what was he doing up there? He lived in Harlem, what was he doing up there? So I came up with a story, and then when I went back and did a little bit of research, I learned a little bit about, the place where he stayed, and, I actually looked at a map of the town, and just to get some of that in my head. But then, of course, usually what I always try to do is set the research aside again, and then continue writing, because I don't want to be overwhelmed by the research. But I also wanted to say, I love your mention of the drowning, because what I was thinking was, he's drowning inside his head, and the only way to make the drowning in the head stop is to drown himself, right? So he has to take this terrible step to stop this thing that once was just so wonderful. And he was really an amazing character, like in terms of how much he did. And you think about musicians now, the other thing too I will say is, he was controversial because, like musicians today, I think about like some hip hop musicians, right, who put out images and songs and things that people love, but they're criticized because those images, the words, might be misogynistic or homophobic, or might, some people adopt them and they don't say, okay, this is just a song by this rapper. They say, oh, this is how all, black people are, right? So, what is it like to carry around inside you, if you're conscious and ethical, right, the knowledge that you have helped to create certain images? And certain people don't care. They just say, I'm getting money, I'm getting paid, it's great, I can do what I want to do. We have the freedom to do what we want to do, which is true, and I agree with that. But on the other hand, it's like, well, because not everybody is, going to be hypercritical and say, well, I can separate the person from, what the image is, or a group of people from the image, and so what does that do to someone? So I also thought, because toward the end of his life, Bob Cole actually backed away from a lot of that earlier, very controversial minstrelsy music, and tried to come up with very uplifting work about black people. And it seemed like shortly after he started to do that, he began to have a nervous breakdown, which made me wonder, was there something deep in his psyche that was actually breaking down, so.
Other questions? Yeah.
Did you ever get in contact with like the family, or is the family aware of the story that you wrote about him?
That's an excellent question. I believe he had a sister, and his mother actually survived him. And I believe that probably the family he was originally from Florida. So I believe there are probably family members in Florida, or I mean, they could be anywhere now, because everyone moves around, and that's several generations ago. But I didn't. But I will tell you this interesting thing, that another one of the stories in this book, the very first story, is called Manhattan, and it's about the first permanent settler to what is now New York City, right? And it turns out that this guy was originally from the Dominican Republic, and he settled, and there's a little bit of history about him. So I actually did, I wrote the story and then did a little bit of research to kind of get everything down. And every so often now I start to, and someone mentioned this on Wikipedia, that I wrote the story. And every so often now I'll get an email from someone who I don't know if they're family, they're probably not family members, but they're just absolutely fascinated. They say, oh, this is great, you wrote, about this guy that no one talks about, he's Dominican, he's black. The records describe him as a black rascal, but he was born in San Domingo. And then I learned from a writer I know that she used that story for a program on Governor's Island last summer. They were trying to get kids to think about New York and the history of New York and their place in it. Right? And so she said, oh yeah, I came across your story, the link to your story, and I used it. I was totally amazed. I said, the book isn't even out, but the story was published in the journal. But it's sort of fascinating how things take a life of their own. So, I mean, maybe at some point I will try to contact Bob Cole's family, or maybe one of them will contact me and say, hey, you didn't get this right. So, which I'd rather it not be that they say, oh, thanks so much for writing about him. So.
Any other ones right now? I've got some. At any point, feel free to stop me because I know your questions are just as interesting or more than mine. All right, so you grew up in St. Louis and were educated at Harvard and NYU, and you taught at NYU and University of Virginia, Northwestern, Rutgers. What place do you identify most with in your writing?
That's a good question. It varies. I feel like a little parts of me are formed by each of the different places I've lived. So I think I calculated this. So I lived maybe about a third of my life in St. Louis in the Midwest, because I had a job commuting between New Jersey and Chicago. I do not recommend having to commute, but a job is a job. So, and I lived maybe a third of my life in New Jersey, and then another place is a little chunk in Boston, maybe about 10 years in Boston. So getting old. But I say that to say that each of those places has influenced me in different ways, and so there's certain kinds of Midwestern values, certain kinds of Northeastern values that I think infuse the writing. And this book actually takes place all over the place. So there are stories that are set in, I don't think there's any story set in New Jersey, but in New York, Boston, Washington, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago. All these places pop up. Santo Domingo, a city called Jérémie in Haiti. All these places pop up. Paris pop up in these stories. But I think at a certain level, I identify in interesting ways with each of those places. The best aspects of each of those places.
So you grew up in St. Louis. Did your family expect you to become a writer? And how did they think about it when you became a writer?
No. I grew up in St. Louis. My parents did not expect me to become a writer. I think they wanted me to be, like most parents, be a doctor or a lawyer. Although I can say now, well, obviously it's very clear. You're not going to go wrong if you become a doctor, ever. But the legal profession is in a little bit of trouble. So I'm thinking, that's not to say if you want to become a lawyer that you shouldn't, but things are a little bit different than they were when I was in my 20s. But I think my parents, my father passed away about 10 years ago. I think my parents are very happy with the path I chose. I actually, became a professor, and their real hope for me was that I would have, a stable job and be able to take care of myself, and of course, help them out, which I do try to do. But the other interesting thing is that my mother always encouraged reading and writing and art. She painted herself, and so actually before I ever wrote a word, I used to draw. So I still draw. I draw on my phone, I draw with pen and paper and stuff like that. And so I was really kind of encouraged in the arts. And then most of the schools I went to also encouraged reading, writing, the arts. So it's kind of interesting to me in a way that, on the one hand, I think my parents, did actively say, become a doctor or a lawyer. But on the other hand, there was also a lot of support for what I am doing.
You've been successful as a novelist, a translator, a short story writer, a poet, writer, a member of which tribe? The poets, the fiction writers, the essayists? What do you think?
Well, that's a great question. These are all great questions. I think of myself as a writer, first and foremost. And I love poetry and I love fiction. I find that I can write poems at any point. I mean, I used to have a full-time job. What was that full-time job now? But I used to have where it was 9 to 5 in an office, a 9 to 5 job in an office in New York. And during lunch, I would go and write poems. I would take time out, sometimes afterwards when I was riding the PATH train back to New Jersey to write poems, right? And I feel like writing poems, I can do that all the time, with fiction, I feel like I need more focused time, and which is why it's taken me forever to write the second novel. But with these stories, what I found was they actually were coming fairly quickly. And I think after years of writing and after years of teaching writing, I think I understand how to put things together. So in a sense, I feel a part of both, allegiance to both. Yeah, and I love translation too. I think it's very, very important. So if anyone in this audience speaks another language or is learning another language, I highly, 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 highly recommend you, please consider translating works from other languages into English, because it's very important that we in this society know what other people in other societies are doing, how they live, what their lives are like. Right? It opens our minds and our senses of possibility, in the world.
You're often mentioned as a successful member of the Darkroom, a group of black students at Harvard in the late 1980s and early 90s, who sponsored some remarkable reading series. Among the star members were Natasha Trethewey, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, and poet laureate of the United States. Major Jackson, another major poet. Do you still stay in touch with the Darkroom Collective, and what influence did it have on your development as a writer?
First of all, we actually had a 25th reunion tour. We went to we went to Chicago, DC, Boston, and Reading, New York. Kind of in tribute to our long history together. And I'll just say this, the fascinating thing about the Darkroom, it's, and I urge all of you, no matter what you're interested in, if you find a like-minded group of people, if it's dance, if it's chess, whatever it is, get with those people, hang out with those people, support them, support each other, and do your thing, right? You don't need an institution to do that. The Darkroom actually was, some of us, here's the deep thing about Darkroom. Some of us were in college, some of us were at Harvard, some of us not in anybody's college. Some people had dropped out of college. Some people had gone to University of Maryland or University of Massachusetts, Boston, or whatever. And, but we were all really interested in seeing black writers, and of course black broadly understood, so there were writers from the African diaspora, so African writers, Afro-Latino writers, writers from Haiti. There are actually a number of members who are from across the globe who read live in Boston, because at that time Boston was, you guys, some of you may know, Boston is a small, very, very, it's a wonderful city, but Boston can be kind of tight, it's not like New York where basically anything, anybody and everybody comes through. Boston's a little kind of on lockdown. So a group of people who got a house, you could get a house very cheaply then, rented like a little half house. They rented this house, and they had this huge living room. And so they said, hey, we'll ask these writers to come in and read their work and perform, and we don't have any money, and we'll see what they say. And of course, the deep thing is, most of these writers, knowing that these were like poor, young, 20-something, 30-something people, said, sure, do it for free. Just make me dinner, or let me sell my books, or have some music. Bring some musicians who live in Boston, right? Or who are some of the artists who live in town? Can you put some of their artwork? Because I want to meet some of these artists, right? So that's what we did. And this happened for a number of years, at first in Cambridge, and then in Boston proper. We got together, and it was amazing, the writers who came through. It really was an extraordinary group of writers. From, just, if you look at, I look back now, it's almost kind of amazing who we were able to get, and usually for no money whatsoever. We gave them awards, in certain cases we gave them awards. We did all kinds of things, we did the whole song and dance. And it just also blew my mind to see how generous people would be. But as a result of that, we also started writing, workshopping our work, and so I feel like I got an education from my fellow writers and from these famous writers for free, although we all had to work, we had to clean, cook and stuff, drive people to the airport, etc. That was almost equal to the writing education I got in college, which is kind of fascinating to think. But it's also another way of saying that, there's so many things you can do on your own, and then with the Darkroom, it was open to everyone in the community. So we had people who were barbers, people who were waitresses, people who would not ever go hear a reading. And then they heard Terry McMillan, or Alice Walker, or John Edgar Wideman, or some of these very famous writers were coming to town, and it was free in Tazakishan. So they showed up, and it was amazing.
All right, here's a literary criticism kind of question, and they'll all know where it's coming from. So, annotations, your novel features allusions to signs, junctures, intense polysemic pleasures, and other terms out of semiotics. Were you influenced by semiotics and the study of theorists like Roland Barthes? And if you were, do you continue to be?
Yes. When I was in college, when I was an undergraduate, I took this course with a very famous scholar named Barbara Johnson. I audited the course, I sat in the course. And we had a number of courses like this, right? And one of the sort of central people in that course that she used, and again, a number of professors who were using this theoretical material, because that was the era of post-structuralism, were people like Jacques Lacan, et cetera. And when I was an undergraduate, I didn't fully understand it. I learned enough to be able to use it in papers, and thought, I'm so smart. But it actually took me a few years after graduating to kind of figure out what was going on. And so as I kept reading and thinking about this work, and reading people like Barthes, like Derrida, Dumont, you all know these people, Deleuze, all the people, French theorists, and then of course later on, Plato, Aristotle, Heidegger, all these people. I began to be able to put it together. So when I was writing annotations, part of what I was doing was kind of working through some of that stuff, and working through the idea of a decentered self. So that's why in that book, you don't get until the very end of the book the word I. You get this I, but not the I to such and such. Because it was you, he, and sometimes I use she, although people never pick that up, right? We, playing with those pronouns, and at the very end, that voice comes to realize that it is an I. So Barthes is definitely one of the people.
There's a kind of fierce honesty about sexuality in your work, which leads you to describe sexual experiences in annotations and other works. For example, in annotations you write, "Your penis is a woodwind that some play better than others." I wonder if you consider that kind of honesty simple directness, or is it transgressive? And if it is transgressive, why?
Well, nowadays I sometimes wonder, it's sort of fascinating because you can find anything online. And when I wrote annotations, the internet was still very basic. So I think there was Mosaic or something. There was that original search engine which seemed so cool, and now it's just, it was really prototypical and primitive. But on a certain level, I mean, I think it is kind of transgressive to write about sexuality, and try to write about it honestly. Try to talk about, you know, who you are, what your desires are, who we are, because we are, among many things, many aspects of ourselves, sexual beings. And so I think one of the things I was most worried about, you know, with that first book was that when my parents read it, what would they say? Would they freak out? But they were cool with it, you know. And you know, since then I haven't looked back. But I do think, you know, that there's a way to write about sexuality. Not said that I want to prescribe that, but I think there are certain ways to write about sexuality that can be interesting and informative, and other ways I think that are just, you know, kind of prurient. But that, you know, that people want that too, so I don't think that's bad.
All right, what is the Emotional Outreach Project, and how has it evolved since you first developed it?
Okay, so the Emotional Outreach Project is it's sort of a conceptual project that I started in 2003, and I was trying to think about how could I respond to the fact that we were going to be in another war. I mean, I think the country's been in a war for most of my lifetime, right? The Vietnam War, and then there was the Gulf War, and then there've been other kinds of little wars, and there was that, you know, a war in Iraq, and, well, Afghanistan, of course, we don't forget Afghanistan, and then Iraq, right? And it seems like, I don't know, it's just an endless war, right? So I wanted to respond, and I thought, what would be an interesting way to do it? So I thought, one of the first responses to 9/11 and then to the war was emotion. And so how can I address the, you know, issues of emotion, right? The various emotions people are feeling. So I came up with these little cards, and on the cards I put a different emotion, like fear, love, hope, compassion, schadenfreude, which is like, you know, an unusual emotion, right? You know, that some of them were positive, some of them were negative. And then what I started to do was, and I put a little, you know, note on the back that said, you know, dear friend, if you have this emotion, like a negative emotion, like fear, anger, sorrow, you can use this card as part of a ritual. You can burn it, you could give it to someone, you could, you know, I don't know, come up with some way of using it to get rid of that emotion. If you got a card that had a positive emotion, love, hope, kindness, I'm trying to think, what's another really joy, right? And you needed that emotion, right? You woke up one morning and you were like, oh my God, I just feel terrible, and I feel really angry, and I really need some joy. But you had that little card, so you can look at the card and just remind you what joy is, right? Joy can be anything you want it to be. So anyway, so I was giving these away, and I started to do it, and I would change the stuff on the back, and then, so then I started exhibiting them at this one little gallery that was in Brooklyn, and then they went to Germany. And so then the most recent version of it, and I actually brought some with me to give out, is what I call emotional exercises, which are, these are little things you can do to kind of tune your emotions. So they're usually, and these are all nice things. Some of them are observation, some of them involve giving, some involve sharing, some involve making things for yourself and other people. So I felt like, you know, this is a nice intervention, and so I created them and distributed them last winter. I'm trying to remember when, yeah, in 2014. And what I hope to do this summer, last summer what I did was, with the older, 2 summers ago, the older version, they went to Germany, and I decided to do them in English and German, and because Germany once had a historic, obviously Jewish population, I put them in Yiddish. And a friend who was there, because I couldn't afford to go to Germany, a friend of mine who was there said that, you know, people picked up the English ones, and they were like, oh, this is cool, you know. And they picked up the German ones, and they said, oh, this is cool. But when they got to the ones in Yiddish, because it had the Yiddish lettering, the Hebrew letter, they sort of freaked out. They were like, what is this? You know, who is this person? Who created this, right? And so they said, oh, this person from, you know, and my friend said, where? Where are you going to say? You know, I was like, where's he from? Where is he from? And he said, he's from the United States. And I was like, what is his background? And he said, well, he's this black guy. And they were like, black guy? writing Yiddish emotions, right, to sort of freak people out. But I also thought it was important to have not just the English and the German, but they also, right, these, a language that once was so strong there, a population that once contributed so much. I think that's, people of Jewish faith in Germany again, to be part of the conversation. So as a kind of outreach. So with the new cards, as I said, I'll give some out. I brought some. You'll see they're little things you can do, and then on the back now I finally gotten with the time and the times, and they have a QR code, so you can just scan it in on your phone and let me know how you use the card.
Do you want to wait until the end to hand them out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So recently your translation of Hilda Hilst's Portuguese novel "Letters from a Seducer" has been widely praised. Why did you choose her novel to translate?
Well, I translate a lot of different work, and one of the things that I really try to focus on is I read a few other languages, and I'm really interested in the kinds of work that won't otherwise be translated. So I find that you look at the translations that are out there. There are far fewer works that are translated by women, right, than men. There are far fewer works that are translated by, in any of the societies in America, black writers, indigenous writers, mixed race writers, etc. There are far fewer works translated by LGBTQ writers. So those are the writers that I focus on. With Hilda Ilst, I actually was asked to write an introduction. I was familiar with the work, introduction for the first English translation, which was translated by two writers, one Brazilian and one French, Canadian American. And so I wrote the introduction, and then they said, the publisher, it was a joint publisher, US and Brazil, they said, would you translate the next book we're going to do? And I foolishly said, oh, of course, I'll translate it from the Portuguese. And it was an incredible challenge. Because, as I learned after I agreed to do this, in Brazil, in Portuguese, for people for whom Portuguese is their native language, Hilda Ilst is considered A, extremely controversial, and B, difficult, right? People would say, I would ask people, what do you think this word means? And they were like, I don't know. You tell me, what do you think it means? I don't know, And these were, Brazilian friends of mine. So, but I also, Ilst was an amazing writer, a really kind of interesting, utterly original voice. And so I translated this book, and I really do hope people read it. It's actually very, very scandalous on a certain level, because she was one of these writers. She was so original that people didn't know what to do with her, and she had a cult following, but she wanted lots and lots of readers. So she did this outrageous thing of taking pornography, the language of pornography, and putting it into the work, hoping people would read it. Of course, people didn't read it. They just called her like that wild, crazy, pornographic writer. But the book itself, the book that I translated, is just an extraordinary book, and it was a joy to do.
Do you read widely in Latin American literature, and are you planning other translations?
I do. I try to read as widely as possible across the globe. I'm drawn especially to Latin American and African literature. I hope to be able to do another translation. I actually did translate the work of another Brazilian writer, who, his name is João Willis, and I first learned about him because he won Brazil's version of Big Brother. Whenever I tell people this, like literary people, they just could care less. They're like, you even know what, many of them don't even know what Big Brother is. But anyway, so he won Brazil's Big Brother, and it was really controversial for a lot of reasons that he won. But anyway, so he won, and then he became a politician. And so it turns out he is the second openly gay legislator in Brazil's, sort of like their Congress. And he's very outspoken, he's very political, and he's constantly being attacked by like people who are very, very like ultra-conservative people. But he wrote this amazing little book before he got famous. And so I translated the whole book. So I hope someone will publish it soon.
Let me go to Cold in counter narratives. and this is an extemporaneous question, so if you don't want to answer it, you don't have to. But I just noticed as you were reading it, there was kind of a breathless quality about your reading it, and I'm wondering how that breathless quality fits in with the narrative itself.
The breathless quality, I think, comes from the fact that on the one hand, as you can hear, there actually were stops, right? There were periods. It's not pure stream of consciousness, but it is partially stream of consciousness. So what I wanted to give a sense of is that it's like his mind is flowing, that music is flowing. You can hear those moments where the music kind of just extrudes itself in, you know, so like they're like almost like, I don't know if you heard, there were parts that actually almost sounded like, actually reading it, I thought, this sounds like hip hop. You know, it's like weird, it's like, you know, but of course he's like a forerunner of, but you know, we look, you go back far enough and you find the forerunner. So hip hop actually starts to pop up, and it's kind of wild, because it's like a story about someone 100 years ago, but I have hip hop. But anyway, so I wanted to give that sense of like music, like the language actually becoming almost like poetry, and then beyond poetry, because hip hop is a form of poetry, right? Becoming even beyond just words, poetry as words, but poetry as sound, poetry as music, and then going back to narrative. But it's always this forward onrushing thing, like that creek that it ends up, walking into, and then submerging himself under. So to give that sense of like, he's almost out of breath, he's almost out of time. He can't really even think anymore, but the mind is just still running until he actually figures out a way to shut it off.
All right, one more about cold. So the title of the story is Cold. Is that the cold of the creek? The cold of isolation, of racism, of death?
It's all of those things, and then of course, you know, if you say it, some people would say, when they pronounce the word cold, they say cold, right? So cold, it could be Bob Cole, or cold, all the things that you just said.
In another story in Counter Narratives, Acrobatique, you tell the story behind the black female circus performer that Edgar Degas depicted as Miss Lala at the Cirque Ferdinando, now in the National Gallery in London. Why did you choose this portrait to write about?
Okay. So I'd seen this picture, but I never paid attention to it. And then maybe about a year and a half ago, because a lot of times I go right at the main branch of the research branch, the Schwarzman branch of the New York Public Library. So right near the library is the J.P. Morgan Library, which is just an incredible building, right? And there's another, I had been there a few times, but you know, it was one of those places where, New York is one of these places where there's so many amazing things that you could basically spend every day going to some different museum or, site and find it, you're constantly finding interesting things. So anyway, I was near there, I said, let me just check this out. So I went in there, and then I saw the picture of Miss Lala, and I didn't know anything about it. So I went up to the exhibit, went upstairs, I think it was upstairs, and so here's the fascinating thing. Miss Lala is the only image of a black person that the famous painter Edgar Degas, who was a famous impressionist painter, ever painted. Now, you probably say, well, okay, he lived in France, why would he be painting black people? But here's the interesting thing. His mother's family was from Louisiana, and they owned slaves. And his mother and he actually had cousins, who are actually, some of his relatives are still alive, who were black people. He actually went to Louisiana, and he's got a famous painting, I think it's called In the Cotton Market. But in this painting, there are no black people, which is really fascinating. Okay, so I just thought that was really fascinating. And so he's got this painting of this black woman acrobat, although in the painting, when you first see the painting, you can't always tell. The way that her skin color is depicted, you can't really tell it's a black woman, right? But it turns out, so of course, the exhibit had all this information on her, and I was transfixed, because she was one of the most famous acrobats in the 19th century. She was so famous, she traveled all over Europe. People could not stop talking about her. They were obsessed with her. And she did this extraordinary thing where she would hang upside down, and she would have a bit in her mouth, and she would have a cannon hanging upside down, and she would fire the cannon. She never fell. Other members of her troop fell, like, fell to the ground. And of course, they didn't have netting, because you can imagine it was they were like terrifying jobs, I mean, you got to be a pro to do this, right? And she was tiny too, okay? And people were obsessed with her. So I thought, why is she not famous? And then I thought, what was her life like? And then I thought, like, what would she sound like? And then I thought, why did he paint her? One other thing I'll say about this painting. Degas was an incredible draftsman. So if you ever go to, you can look online, you go to a museum, you'll see, he has a gift for line and color. When he was painting this painting, he could not get the roof of the Cirque Fernando right. He kept struggling, and so he actually painted her several different ways and couldn't get this roof right. So he actually had to bring in a structure to help him draw the perspective of that roof. So then I thought, isn't that fascinating? Like the one picture he paints of a black person, this black woman, he can't actually, as great an artist as he can get her, but he can't get the background right. So they got me thinking, okay, well, I got to write a story about this. I'll just say the one little thing about the story is it actually starts, the words go down the page, almost hanging like someone on a wire, and then at the end, the words go like this too, and there's points where it sort of zigzags down one way and zigzags down another to give you a sense of this law.
All right, so in the story, Edgar Degas is trembling when he hands his card to Miss Lala. What was that trembling about? Was it nervousness or sexual excitement? What was the trembling?
I think it was a little bit of both, because Degas was already very famous at the time that the story would have taken place. He was very famous. And the interesting thing about Degas, it was said that Degas never had a relationship with anyone, right? A woman or a man or anything, right? And so, I thought that was really kind of interesting. But then, because he has all these beautiful paintings of women, right? And of course, of male acrobats and things, but primarily like dancers, and he has just a gift with portraying women. So I was fascinated by that. But then, there's a statement that another famous French writer says, in which Degas invited this French writer, Edmond de Goncourt, to his studio to meet Miss Lala. And he says, I want you to meet ma négresse, which basically means my black woman. And I thought, huh? Because there's no record that they actually, he owned her, even though they weren't dating or anything like that. It was really kind of strange. And the word négresse actually has multiple resonances. One would just be black woman, the other one would be like the N-word, right? So, but also it might be used as a word of affection, right? Like in certain romance languages, like negrita, negrito, right? It means, beloved, So it has this multiple meanings. So I was really curious about that, and I thought, and people described the guy as like he was kind of strange, So I thought he's trembling, and she's looking at him, and she's thinking, I don't know what the deal is with this dude, but he's painting my picture, and he's famous, so I'm gonna deal with him. But she basically says, I'm on guard when I'm hanging out with him. So that I kind of wanted to give you a sense of like his nervousness before someone who in their own way was very famous, but also how he was, maybe a little excited and a little creepy, another side of the guy.
So the painting, yeah.
Is that before his impressionist years?
It was, yeah, it's actually, I think during it was probably I want to say kind of at the beginning, because you start to see, in that painting, it's amazing when you see like the way that he plays with color and light, right? So you get, she's got this beautiful costume on, it's kind of rose and purple, and then you get the lights, it would have been like, I guess, gas lights, the early gas lights, flickering in the top of the ceiling. And I try to capture a lot of that in the story. But yeah, it would have been like, against, it really is, during his early Impressionist period.
So the perspective on Miss Lala is very interesting because it's looking up, as if skirt. So I'm wondering if is the painting a kind of transformation of her into a sexual object, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think there's some of that. I think there's an admiration of her skill and talent. There is, of course, I mean, you know, as a female figure being depicted, there is some sexualization. I mean, the thing is that the guy, I think, more than anything, focuses on her skill as an acrobat. But it turns out that at this exhibit, one of the things I saw was that people were really kind of obsessed with her. They were obsessed with her sexuality. They wanted to know, because of course, how could a woman who was this tiny and muscular, right? What was her background? Where did she come from? Do these incredible stunts and not get hurt, right? I mean, she did it for years and years and years. Again, as I said, without a single accident. And so people were really fascinated. And even today, when you think about women who do extraordinary things and the way that the society talks about those women, and there's sort of grudging respect, but there's also sexism and misogyny. So I think there's a little of that in there, but I really do see it as, in a sense, a kind of tribute to her that also was for him, a kind of recognition that I can capture her, but I haven't fully captured her.
Can you tell us about the novella in Counter Narratives?
Well, there are several novellas. So I'll say one is this, the longest one starts in Haiti and moves to Kentucky to a convent, right? So it sounds like a totally crazy story. And I will say no more, but part of what happens is the main character is a young woman named Carmel. She starts out as a teenager and she becomes a woman in it. And in the beginning of the story, you're told that you don't know whether someone has put a spell on her. Her mother works roots, so you don't know if her mother put a spell on her, or there's rumors that someone cut out her tongue, though of course they could check that. But anyway, so she doesn't have a voice, and then by the end of the story, you see her coming into her own, into her voice, into her womanhood, into her power, right? So she has these powers that she can't really even control. So it's a sort of a speculative story that's also a historical story. And so that's a long story. And I'll say the other novella, there's several, but one of the other novellas, one of my favorites, is called The Aeronauts. And so let me just ask a question. How many people knew that they used hot air balloons? They had hot air balloons, let alone used them during the Civil War. Did anyone know that? Isn't that kind of amazing that they actually had hot air balloons? Okay, so I was fascinated by the story of there being hot air balloons during the Civil War. So this story it starts in Philadelphia, and involves people in Philadelphia, including this little black kid who's very smart, but there isn't really a place for him. He ends up getting a job working for one of the people who works on these hot air balloons. And it takes place during the Civil War. So I actually have a Civil War battle in here. So I was a little nervous because a lot of people are obsessed with the Civil War, and they're gonna come for me and say, you didn't get this right. So I had to make sure I got all that stuff right. But anyway, and then I'm not gonna tell you what happens at the end, but it's a very dramatic ending involving this little kid and the battle lines and a hot air balloon. What's that?
Is there a single name for what you're attempting to counter in Counter Narratives?
I would say the official stories that we have been given over the years. So a lot of these stories offer a kind of counter story, omissions, slippages that exist, right? So we think of, for example, again, the kind of first non-Native American settlers to New York. Most people would say the Dutch, but in fact, we know from historical record that there was someone before the Dutch, right, who said, I've had enough, I'm gonna go live with the native people, I'm gonna be a trader, trader, although it's interesting, the trader can sound like traitor, but anyway, a trader and a translator, I'm gonna make my way with them. And that story is pretty much elided, although I'm told there is a plaque on his behalf somewhere on the Upper West Side, right? Maybe it might even be in Spanish Harlem. But stuff like that, I wanted to fill in some of those. Also, the official stories that we get, I wanted to kind of give the other side of the story.
All right, last one of mine anyway. So, what do you want readers to know about your work as a writer that you think they probably don't know?
I want everyone to read the book and enjoy it. And enjoy it, you know, people will read it on different levels. To know that, you know, for example, a book like this, some of the stories seem tough, and some of them are very easy to get into. Like I said, the story I just mentioned, Aragon. But I really want them to know that, you know, I write these stories to be read, right? To be read and enjoyed and thought about and picked through. And some of you all are filmmakers, you know, make a movie of it, you know. You know, if you like Selma, you know, the aeronauts stuff. But just that you know, that I write them to be read. I love literature. I love reading all kinds of things. You know, I love watching movies and TV. So all of those things, all those aspects of it. Listen, obviously, we talked about music, dance, architecture. All those things are in this book, and I hope, you know, as people read it, that some of it comes through.
Any more questions? You guys got any more? All right. Well, let's give him a hand. It's been a real pleasure. All right. Thank you all. And for my students among you, make sure you get the sign-up list. And if you want to buy a novel, I believe that we have a few more novels here for sale. And make sure you all do your reading next week. I'll see you next Wednesday.
And the new book will be out in May, so yes.